Okay, let's dive right in. Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're putting on our political science professor hats and going on a pretty rigorous intellectual journey. We're going to deconstruct how we actually talk about power, authority, and control. Because, in everyday life we hear terms like law enforcement, market forces, or authorized use of force literally all the time. They sound so clean, right? So procedural. But today, we are stripping away that sanitized institutional language to ask a really uncomfortable but absolutely necessary question. What exactly is force? And more importantly, what reality are we hiding when we use that word?
To understand how we hide this reality, we kind of have to look at how academia and philosophy operate. There's this old biblical critique about people who obsess over tiny minor details while totally ignoring massive glaring truths, straining at gnats while swallowing camels. Well, in political philosophy, the constant demand for, rigorous definitions often falls into this exact trap. Academics and legal scholars will endlessly parse and subdivide a term like force until its real-world physical meaning completely evaporates. What starts as a genuine attempt to clarify things ends up as a really convenient evasion of reality.
So here's our syllabus for today's masterclass. We're going to cover the problem of abstraction, the core definitions of force versus violence, the historical shift from conquest to administration, the spectrum of coercion, and lastly, the besieging condition. Let's jump into the first one.
Section 1. The problem of abstraction, or how we evade physical reality.
Consider for a second how well the word force behaves in polite society. It's totally acceptable in public legal documents, diplomatic summaries, corporate briefings. It carries weight, sure, but incredibly, it carries no blood. When we say force, it suggests a sort of administrative inevitability. But let's aggressively pull ourselves back to physical reality here. Violence? You can't discuss violence indefinitely without feeling some moral discomfort, because violence is concrete. It breaks bones. It leaves bodies displaced, restrained, or worse. So this distinction between the word force and the word violence isn't just semantic. It is deeply, profoundly political. When violence is blatantly applied by a mob, we all know exactly what it is. But when that exact same physical act is mediated through institutions, uniforms, and legal procedures, we suddenly launder the terminology and we just call it force.
Moving on to Section 2. Defining force versus violence, the etymological dissection.
To completely reject this whole academic evasion, let's look directly at the linguistic roots. I want to pause the lecture for a second and throw a Socratic question your way. What precisely distinguishes force from violence? Think about it. How is it that courts can legally authorize an officer to apply quote-unquote reasonable force to physically tackle and restrain someone while condemning those exact same physical motions by an unauthorized citizen as criminal violence?
Now, what's really fascinating here is how etymology exposes their shared origins. The English word force comes from the Latin fortis, which just means strong or powerful. Originally, it basically meant capacity or strength brought to bear. Now, violence, on the other hand, comes from violentia, rooted in vis, which, guess what, also means physical power or force. But even back in Roman times, violentia carried a moral charge. It meant power acting with excess or illegitimate harm. Language itself pulled off this brilliant conceptual maneuver. It built a distinction based purely on authority and perspective. In short, force is simply legitimate power, while violence is illegitimate power.
But we absolutely have to remember the material truth here. While one term preserves institutional respectability and the other preserves moral discomfort, the physical reality is exactly the same. The body being struck experiences impact regardless of the terminology used in a courtroom. A bruised rib is a bruised rib, whether it was delivered by authorized force or unauthorized violence.
All right, Section 3, From Conquest to Administration, the Historical Shift.
So we need to shift our focus from how we speak about power today to how historical political orders successfully transform their vocabulary over the centuries. Earlier political orders, they were actually incredibly honest. They spoke openly of conquest, subjugation, extracting tribute. Rulers proved their authority through superior arms. Full stop. But over centuries, as institutions matured, the vocabulary totally shifted. As you can see, conquest became administration. Domination became governance. Tribute became taxation. Political violence didn't just vanish from the earth. It kind of just got a desk job. It migrated straight into polite, institutional language.
The modern state is literally the ultimate crystallization of this shift. Just look at how the influential sociologist Max Weber defined it. He said the state is the entity claiming a monopoly on the legitimate use of physical force within a territory. The crucial operative word there is legitimate. The violence still persists, right? But it appears morally filtered through laws and procedures. Force, therefore, emerges simply as violence rendered acceptable through institutional recognition. Which brings us to Section 4, the spectrum of coercion, threat, and use.
Now that we've nailed down what force actually is, we need to examine exactly how it functions structurally in our everyday society, because our modern political order depends way less on perpetual brutality than you might think. Violence is an episodic event. It's a spectacle, a sudden rupture in daily life. Force, however, force is continuous, it's latent, it's structural. Force operates quietly through the anticipated possibility of violence. Think about it. Citizens comply with laws not because armed agents are standing right next to them 24/7, but because there's a widely shared recognition that coercion is always available if resistance occurs. Force exists prior to its actual application.
Let's trace how this builds along an escalation chain. Political societies maintain a clear spectrum of coercion. At the softest end, you've got administrative penalties, right? Fines and fees. But what happens if you persistently refuse to pay a simple parking ticket? Well, it escalates to the seizure of assets. What if you physically resist the seizure of your assets? It escalates to arrest and imprisonment. And what if you resist arrest? It ultimately ends in physical restraint and, potentially, lethal force. Every benign administrative rule is fundamentally backed by the threat of violence at the very end of the chain.
And that leads us to our final point, Section 5, the besieging condition, or force as background reality. Modern political life unfolds within a constant, ambient condition of enforceable limits. Just look at this network of limits that surrounds us. We're talking property boundaries, contractual obligations, regulatory frameworks, surveillance systems, national borders. These form the actual architecture of our society. As citizens, we navigate this incredibly complex web every single day without needing constant physical confrontation, precisely because the underlying threat of compelled compliance is so thoroughly established.
The absolute brilliance and the effectiveness of this system lies entirely in its normalization. We experience force as a background reality, honestly, much like gravity, rather than as some extraordinary intrusion. We replace overt domination with legitimacy, and that successfully masks the foundational principle of literally all political order, the exclusion of some, backed by enforceable power.
So the crucial point is this unlaundered definition. Consider this the grand finale of our lecture today. Force is simply violence abstracted from the act, legitimized through law and embedded within institutional systems of enforcement. Now, recognizing this doesn't necessarily glorify or condemn the state, it simply restores historical truth to institutions that really like to present themselves as perfectly natural or inevitable.
Which leaves us with one incredibly provocative question to close out this explainer. How did political order come to rest upon such a structure in the first place? To truly answer that, we'd have to look backward, far beyond modern governance and law, straight into the brutal reality of conquest itself. But, well, that's a masterclass for another day. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive, and keep questioning the words we use to define our world.